In this video, we will discuss Schedule J of Form 5471. Schedule J tracks the earnings and profits of controlled foreign corporations, or CFCs. Page 1 has 14 rows and 6 columns. Page 2 has the same 14 rows and has 9 columns. I feel it is easier to understand all of the columns shown together, so I have recreated Schedule J with the same columns and rows all on one page. Let's first break up the columns into categories. Columns A through C show Section 959 C3 earnings and profits. Columns E1 through E5 show Section 959 C1 earnings and profits. And columns E6 through E10 show Section 959 C2 earnings and profits. We will refer to these as C1, C2, and C3 earnings and profits. C3 earnings and profits have not yet been taxed to the U.S. shareholder. C1 and C2 earnings and profits have previously been taxed to the U.S. shareholder. Thus, the C1 and C2 earnings and profits are referred to as previously taxed earnings and profits, or PTEP. C1 earnings and profits exist only if the CFC has investments in U.S. property. The most frequent type of investment in U.S. property is a loan from the CFC to the U.S. shareholder or to a U.S. person related to the U.S. shareholder. For purposes of this video, we are going to assume that the CFC had no investments in U.S. property. This means that we can ignore columns E1 through E5. Column E9 tracks PTEP created under Section 245 Cap A-D. This type of PTEP is created when a CFC is owned by a domestic corporation and the CFC receives certain hybrid dividends from another CFC. Here we are going to assume that the CFC received no hybrid dividends. This means that we can ignore column E9. Columns E6 and E7 deal with PTEP created under the Section 965 transition tax enacted as part of TCJA. Under the Section 965 transition tax, U.S. shareholders of CFCs in existence as of the end of 2017 were typically required to include in their income all of the CFC's earnings and profits. These earnings were generally taxed at a reduced rate through a sliding scale deduction allowable under Section 965C. Column E7 and Section 965B applied only if the U.S. shareholder owned multiple CFCs, with some CFCs having positive earnings and profits and other CFCs having deficits in earnings and profits. We are going to assume that this CFC had no Section 965B PTEP. This means that we can ignore column E7. We are then left with PTEP-related columns of E6, E8, and E9. Column E6 represents PTEP related to the Section 965 transition tax. Column E8 represents PTEP related to GILTI inclusions. And column E9 represents PTEP related to Subpart F income inclusions. These three PTEP columns are the most frequently used columns. Let's go through a typical example of completing this simplified version of Schedule J. We will assume that the CFC was just created during the year. Thus, it had no earnings and profits at the beginning of the year. The current year earnings and profits of the CFC is 100 in local currency. There was nothing special going on, so the total current and accumulated earnings and profits was 100. The U.S. shareholder completed Form 8992 and determined that 95 of the 100 needs to be included as a GILTI inclusion. Therefore, on line 8, the 95 of earnings picked up as a GILTI inclusion is reclassified from column A to column E8. As you may recall, these are the C3 columns over here, and these are the C2 columns over here. We are reclassifying from C3 to C2. This reclassification is intended to track the portion of the CFC's earnings which have already been taxed to the U.S. shareholders. Therefore, when these previously taxed earnings are distributed to the U.S. shareholder, they are not taxed a second time. If there were any actual distributions, they would be shown on line 9. The ordering rules for distributions can be a bit complicated, but they usually first come out of C1 PTEP, and then out of C2 PTEP, and then out of C3 non-PTEP. We are assuming no investments in U.S. property, so there are no adjustments to C1 earnings and profits. We will also assume no other adjustments. Thus, the total E&P at the end of the year is 100, with 95 of PTEP in column E8 and 5 of non-PTEP in column A. And that is Schedule J of Form 5471. I hope this video has been helpful.